Hello everyone, and welcome to another of Cohere's podcasts in our series, Are We All Listening? Today I'm very excited to be joined by Julia Zahreddine. Julia and I have worked on and off together in the past in different formats. And Julia, perhaps we could start by you telling us a bit about how we ended up working together, the point at which we met when you were at Urban Refugees, but also even prior to that in the lead up to how you got into advocacy, how you got into the humanitarian sector, shifting power, and all the things that we work on today.
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much for inviting me. So my name is Julia Zahreddine. I am working as an equity and strategy consultant for the Aropa Initiative for International Solidarity, which is a consulting pillar of Aropa Consulting, an organizational management consulting company supporting CBOs, NGOs, and public actors all over the world. So my background and why I arrived to the shifting power space. So I started, so basically I grew up in Lebanon as a kid, and then migrated to France, in the north of France. So I moved from Beirut to the north of France, which gave me quite a good experience of migration. And so I think I was always attracted to development work because I come from, I would say, like multicultural type of family. I have like a dad that is Druze, so coming from the mountains of Lebanon, and my mom is a Christian French woman. So I grew up with this multi-religious environment. And I also discovered quite young that I was queer. So I think that all of this personal experience led me, and also the fact of being, having a complex identity, being an Arab without really speaking the language or having been taught the language when I was a kid living in Lebanon, and this deep desire, I think, to belong. And the complexity of my identity always like pushed me into international work. And I think, it was obvious for me that I would work for the common good. And originally I wanted to specialize in politics and in advocacy. So I started working in South America with advocacy organizations. Then I worked with Oxfam, and then I figured I wanted to maybe get closer to the topics of migration, displacement, and also being more international in my work. So I started working with Urban Refugees, which was an organization supporting refugee-led organizations, so RLOS. We were doing capacity strengthening for RLOs in Uganda, and there were also small grants that were delivered to RLOs along with the capacity strengthening. And there I was managing the advocacy work, and I started, so I felt like who I am to go speak in public spaces about the importance of supporting meaningful refugee participation, because I'm not forcibly displaced, of course. So I started really early on to think about like, what is my role as an ally, and how can I be like what Ringo likes to call an ecosystem catalyst? So I figured I would support RLOs do what I know how to do, which is developing influence strategies. So of course I wasn't like telling RLOs like who to talk to locally, etc., because I have no idea. But I knew like how to spot the right stakeholders. I knew that like you need to target the right people in the right institutions to make the change happen. I knew that you have to develop a relationship and how to structure your asks and how to structure your narrative, etc. So I helped with that. So Urban Refugees and Xavier Project were about to merge, to join forces, which became Cohere after. And so we started to work together. And then I joined Aropa Initiative for International Solidarity, the consulting company I'm working with now. So this is my journey.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks so much. I've always really enjoyed talking to you and bouncing ideas off you because I think I've possibly learned as much from you as from anyone else I've ever worked with. Partly because we don't always agree, and or it doesn't seem like we agree at first, and we have these really interesting debates, and that's one of the best ways to formulate thinking. So that's been fascinating. So I think some of the topics we've touched on in the past we could go into now and also see how they've evolved for you. But I think you mentioned Ringo, that reimagining INGOs and that phrase of being an ecosystem catalyst. You talked about meaningful participation. You talked about being an ally. I wonder how you would define now what success means, or where you see the energy needs to be exerted in this idea of shifting power. Because not to ask too broad a question, in the past I think I felt that if we target all the energy at donors and those in power, including the larger INGOs, then we'll end up with a certain framework and a certain way of thinking about how they could change and how the system could be less top down, and where the agency isn't all sort of in the global north. But what do you think needs to change still now? And even when we talk about those kinds of things like meaningful participation and shifting power, what are the most urgent things that are needed to change?
So I think that I wouldn't say that there is one urgent thing that needs to change. I mean, urgently we need to send money to local organizations, send significant amount of money to local organizations. So practically I'm thinking about how, we can use mechanisms that are used for localization, such as country-based pool funds. I'm not sure, but I believe a few months ago that RLOs weren't part of country-based pool funds, and because of the refugee-led nature. And I think this is something that urgently needs to change to support direct funding. And so RLOs can receive millions. So donors can pivot away from global north-based intermediaries towards more locally led solutions. So I think this is something that urgently needs to happen. I think that more when thinking about allyship, I think that fiscal sponsorship is a super pathway towards supporting local organizations. Basically, you only play the budget and admin role, but all the decision making goes to the RLO. So this is for me something that is really rooted in trust and keeps the decisions in the hand of community responders. And then I think that when I was working with you, I was super focused on internal learning journeys, equity assessment, change management. And I think it's still super important, but with the recent change in the sector, with the tragic cuts in international funding, there is a near paper that was released a few months ago showing that they didn't have specific numbers or quantifiable data, but that there are INGOs still committed to their equitable partnerships commitments, programs, etc. But a lot are fighting for institutional survival, which I completely understand. This has generated a lot of insecurities, for a lot of humanitarian workers, and I also felt this insecurity myself. So I completely understand the challenges, and I'm clear about the challenges. But I'm wondering now if this is the priority in the current context, for institutions for us, ecosystem catalysts to focus on that. So I think I think there should be a complementarity among systems catalysts, and that we should touch on everything at the same time. But what I see perhaps as a big priority is like for donors that still support RLOs to think about how grantees can upgrade beyond the funding period. So, and move towards sustainability and have systems, infrastructures that like demonstrate impact, to diversify funding sources, and that are robust beyond these grants. And so I think that like there are ways that INGOs and donors can support RLOs to do this. And I'm not saying like RLOs lack capacity. I'm talking about, you know, all the kind of challenges that any organization can meet, you know, how to document your impact, how to structure your governance, how to build your reputation, and you know, be resourced to go in places where power and money is concentrated at the moment. Even like if we can, this is not something that we are agreeing with. I'm not saying, for example, that the white professional culture and the way that donors are measuring impact is the right way. I'm saying that we need to be a set of actors that complement each other. And one, for example, is working on the result-oriented support of RLOs to thrive. One is working on passing on funding and educating the donor about like change towards flexible funding, flexible reporting, trust grounded relationships. You know, so I think we should touch on everything at the same time, but with a big focus on like moving significant amount of money to RLOs.
Mm-hmm. But I think you, just to play devil's advocate, I think you just put your finger on the danger with having simplistic targets and sort of framing success in a way that everyone can understand in one sentence, but thereby sacrificing sort of deeper goals. Because this thing of just moving money to RLOs, I mean, is the same thing that was said in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit, where all these massive agencies committed to giving 25% of their funding to local and national actors, and it's never got higher than 3%, and most recent years it's been going down. When the COVID crisis hit, we saw the real nature of these institutional aid agencies, from the donors to the large NGOs, when they pulled out all their staff from any exposure, leaving local organizations to pick up all the pieces. And the exact same thing you just mentioned has happened in the face of these cuts, whereby instead of honoring these commitments to shifting power and agency to local communities, they're supposedly justifiably thinking about institutional survival. And that's why, I mean, I think, unfortunately, I feel that some of the efforts, by going into the specifics of how large NGOs and donors should have more appropriate and equitable partnerships, has been futile, because while they were saying, like they did in 2016, that they were interested in localization and shifting power, in essence they never intended to, because the real power sat from where the money came from. And in the end, ultimately, that would be a bigger priority. And as long as it was more beneficial to follow the needs of the money and the real power, then they would continue to do so. And that's kind of what we're seeing. So then you have to look, okay, where's the real money coming from? And it was when researching this and sort of understanding the more cynical motives behind government aid funding that I really started to doubt the energy and efforts of trying to persuade the aid sector to change. Because, you know, when the last Global Humanitarian Assistance Report came out, which it hasn't been published for a while, but around 2-3 years ago, 82% of all funding came from 20 OECD state government financing from state governments. I mean, most of it was from the US, and now, you know, we see what happens when that's cut, but also from European countries. And when you take a few steps back and you really think about what is tied to that donor funding. You increasingly see insecure states using aid as a way to prop up their power in a world where they're feeling that their power is waning. And even though the agencies further down the chain might have colleagues who are committed to the idea of humanitarianism, got into their job because of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, I found quite a few sources of examples of where even aid agencies were told to be careful not to use aid in a way that disrupts the diplomatic relations with that government. In other words, exclusionary strategies that end up perpetuating suffering will be accepted and will be funded as long as it supports the diplomatic interests of that state. So all the NGOs, in the end, they have to sing to that song sheet. So even going into sort of guidance about how to give unrestricted funding, flexible funding, if the ultimate funding strategies are not driven by motives around the most vulnerable, but around cynical motives in terms of sustaining the power of that state, then surely that will just carry on being redundant. And this goal of saying, well, all we need to do is get more money to RLOs, it's just not going to happen, because ultimately that's not a symptom or an action that is would be representative of the real goals of where the money's coming from. I mean, we're only talking about 80%. There's another 20% of funding which maybe we could get on to talk about. But do you think, even if you get short-term goals of some RLOs getting more funding from that source of funding, just because maybe at a certain time it coincides with something that's palatable for those donors, will it not end up fizzling away again if it ends up threatening the interests of that donor?
No, I completely see what you mean. As I was telling you before, I think like there's a complementarity what we can do, as refugee leaders and as allies. I think like what you're talking about is shifting the mindset of like global north governments, etc., about their motivations. And I think that like in the current environment, when we look at what is politics made of, we have a rise of the extreme right movement. You have these tech bros that are getting closer to these extreme right movements, and the same movements are more and more legitimized at the head of like different governments, etc. So I think this is work that needs to be done, like from the civil society. Of course, like you'll have civil society advocates, and beyond the humanitarian sector, you talk about like funding of war, or even the reasons that generate the need for humanitarian action. So for me, this is something that is here, and that is a problem. And it's how humanitarianism works. All money comes from either governments or like rich people. So we are in a system that is unequal, and that is unfair, and that is unjust. Unfortunately, money for immediate action is concentrated in this place right now. So I'd like you, for example, to play it out. Let's say, okay, if you don't want RLOs to go after the money that is like coming from global donors, which we know, like if you look at any NGO, I would say like the biggest chunk of their money are from governments, foundations, and then you have all the other ones, so high net worth individuals, people from the diaspora, public donation, social enterprises, member fees, So I'd like you to play it out, like if you want money to come, for example, locally or from sources that you think aren't cynical, as you say, how are you moving from point A to point B? Like, what is your theory of change without RLOs falling apart because they don't have adequate funding in the meantime,
So let me give you two examples from the context that I understand. In northern Kenya, in Kakuma refugee camp at the moment, Turkana West, the sub-county, has about 350,000 people, all of them are affected by forced displacement because they're either local Kenyans who are massively affected by the 200,000 plus refugees in Kakuma. And there's been this drive from donors, but also from the government, and the discussions are called this Sharika plan for more integration between refugees, so refugees can contribute to the local economy. But this place is a desert, basically. I mean, if you drive from Lodwar to Kakuma, there's a stretch where not even scrubland grows. It's just almost rock. And it unfortunately can't really naturally support 350,000 people without either aid funding or some kind of radical revolution of maybe some kind of tech talent hub, which some RLOs are trying to get going with a bit of success. But to reach all the 350,000 people is going to be a challenge. But even before, I mean, this drive for integration is relatively new, and Kakuma has been open since the 1990s. And it wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for donor funding. I mean, there's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars being put into sustaining that camp for so many years. The Kenyan government would have done one of two things if the donor funds weren't there. They would have either closed the border, which would have been bad, or what I think is more likely, which because it happened in the 1970s before massive refugee camps was even really invented, they would have allowed refugees to integrate. You know, refugees from Idi Amin's time from Uganda all integrated in Kenya. There were no refugee camps. And then you wouldn't need so many RLOs. I mean, I think there are over 200 RLOs in Kakuma. There would be the same number of refugees spread around towns and cities in Kenya. There's over 100 towns in Kenya that have 20,000 people or more in them. You know, so that number could be absorbed without dramatically affecting the nature of those towns and cities. And RLOs would be doing more inventive things rather than worrying about people only surviving on one meal a day and all the other challenges that they face in Kakuma. And you could ask, well, why did the donors prop it up? It's politics, and there's a quote I found in some research that the head of the High Commission for Britain in Kenya was warned by London, so even higher power in Whitehall in London, to take a few steps back from criticising the government because Britain depends so heavily on Kenya for strategic things. We've got a military base there that trains up to 30,000 people a year. America's got a couple of bases where we're positioned to sort of launch attacks from. Britain would not be able to survive without Kenyan food. We eat vegetables from Kenya in the tons every day, and Britain depends on Kenya, and that's why diplomats were told to stop putting heat on the Kenyan government for some of this divisive politics, including keeping refugees at arm's reach. So you could say, what would be the alternative? Yes, some of the RLOs that exist and some of the structures that exist would be, if Kakuma closed, some people would suffer, but at the same time, it's not sustainable. It shouldn't be there. The success of Kakuma would be a smaller population in the future. And it's a great place, for a few people, but not for that many. And I could give a similar story for the Rwanda-Congo conflict around, and you can very easily say very similar arguments for the way the relationship between certainly Britain and the Ugandan and Rwandan regime. So what we don't know what would be on the other side of the coin if there was no aid funding to governments that are increasingly authoritarian. We don't really know what it would look like for sure. But I just think just accepting to depend on it seems like it's got inevitable losses if we just accept the system and accept donors as being on the side of the most vulnerable. And I'm talking about those kind of donors. I'd like to talk in a minute about private donors, like either corporations or high net individuals, but also the crowdfunding community donors, and how maybe some of the things we've been working on could be more applicable in those sort of sources of funding. I mean, it might be unfair what I'm saying, because there may easily be some states, I think there are some, who have a bigger picture of what a more peaceful world could look like if actually international aid funding is used in a genuinely progressive and positive way that reduces inequality around the world without knowing all the details. I think the Irish government has been like that. I mean, Ireland's had their own experience of being colonised, which might be why, as well as, I mean, I think the Dutch approach at the moment also seems to be more open-minded, but unfortunately in the UK, I don't really believe that the aid funding strategies have been decoupled with the sort of diplomatic goals of the country as a whole.
I completely understand your assessment, and I philosophically I'm I'm with you on what you say. But now I'm like, pragmatically, how do you change a system, So this is what I'm asking you. I'm like, okay, so let's say we don't accept to depend on it. Of course, I think it's not the best case scenario to depend on aid, like it's and to depend on global north donor money because of all the reasons we know. But I'm wondering, like, what's your theory of change? How do you do to not depend on this anymore? And I don't know, maybe, for example, RLOs wouldn't grow because, like, for example, my job is to support RLOs through Pride, so it's my goal. I could, like, in the future have another goal, which is like create more equitable relationships between global north and global south governments, but now I'm focusing on getting high amount of money to RLOs. And so maybe organizations don't grow because this is what I'm seeing. Like, what are your interim steps?
But for an organization to grow, it is an inbuilt assumption of, and it's sort of a global north or sort of Western concept of scaling, which has been sort of drilled into our way of thinking. But the way I see it is, unfortunately, I mean, there's some good NGOs out there for sure, and there are some good large RLOs out there for sure. But I also think, and I think some of the RLEs I've spoken to, including some I've spoken to on this podcast, would agree that the larger the RLOs become and the more they depend on that same source of donor funding, the more they start to look like, yeah.
Let me reframe my question. Like, this is not exactly what I wanted to say. Like, I was saying, like, how do you want the RLO ecosystem to grow? How do you want, like, this redistribution of power from global north headquartered NGOs towards local organizations to happen without depending on the sources of funding? It's really a curiosity for me. I'm just wondering, like, if you have like a roadmap for making that happen.
Well, I don't, as Cohere, I don't expect us. I mean, part of the decision we've made in the last few years is to not try and expect that we can change that system.
What the ecosystem, like the allies, should do, us as a meaningful refugee participation movement.
Yeah. So what we've been exploring is a sort of parallel systems, which maybe parallel approaches, which if they can work, can bring more and more allies. And one of the elements of that is to be much more rigid about thinking how the money is tied to cynical or ulterior motives. So instead of going for that sort of aid funding through those aid funding programs, to just start totally from the other perspective. So start from the leaders and inclusive leaders from the most marginalized, and think about what it is that they're looking for, that they can sustain their agency and not become a tool for the existing system, and to start from that perspective. So if that might be funding, but what we've found that's been fascinating is that it doesn't always have to be funding, certainly not non-profit funding in the way that we imagine. Like if you go to Ramwanja now in southwest Uganda, there's so many refugee-led initiatives that have never received a dollar from any aid donor, but have got these fascinating projects off the ground. Because in their case, it's beneficial that Ramwanja is in an area of relative economic development, economic growth. I think that's undeniable. Anyone who goes there can see it progressing every year, from spread of electricity to better roads to much better facilities, and the town is growing, etc. So then the question then comes, how do you shift that development to be more inclusive? So what we notice a lot of the RLOs doing, I'll give an example of Away Foundation. There's a women-led, really small by humanitarian standards, organization run by 19-year-old girls who've just left school. They started the project when they were in school, and they have access to a small amount of money to get micro agri businesses off the ground, like buying some chicks or piglets. So the way that they turn that into basically an RLO as opposed to just a business is that they go to vulnerable families and they support them they buy a piglet for them, and then they help them to start a micro business with that initial startup support. So what they're doing there is turning an existing economic opportunity into a more inclusive and equitable opportunity. And so what we've been doing as Cohere in Ramwanja, we have 2 colleagues who are living there full time. All they do now, really, most of the time, is spend time with people like that, just discussing and listening to their plans and sharing bits of opportunities they hear. Like there's a new bank opening up a branch in Ramwanja, and it's a national bank, and they're now offering access to finance to refugees. It's still not that easy to access. That's a type of example of, if you're looking for a $100 loan, Cohere colleagues can give a few tips as to how you might be able to get that, buy a few chickens and build a chicken shed and then get a business going. That's actually what we spend most of our time doing. And then those organizations end up not being dependent on aid funding and being able to stay true to the vision for change that the most marginalized have in their community. It doesn't work everywhere though, because I could share my experiences of working with RLOs in Congo during a crisis and a conflict, and it's a pretty challenging question, and maybe different answers to that one. But yeah, that might give you a picture of how I think we can look outside of the typical system of humanitarian aid and still see hope for ideas where people don't have to lose their agency.
I mean, I see what you say, but at the same time, like my experience with refugee-led organizations. So, like for example, at the moment, I'm the learning partner. With Aropa, Initiative for International Solidarity. I act as the learning partner and me lead for really the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, who has like grantees a bit all over the world, who's like pushing donors to send flexible funding and redistributing funding according to equitable principles, supporting community leadership in decision making, etc. And I see what I'm thinking is that like once the money, I'm trying to get this money fast, because this is my job at the moment. And I'm trying so in my shoes, I'm like, how do I get urgently a lot of money for RLOs that are gonna do some like dignified responses? So let's say, I know that like, for example, what I really love about what's happening when RLOs are resourced with significant amount of money is that they're able to deliver dignified responses. And I say it's great to have electricity, to have facilities, etc. Of course, it's great. But what I think is, for example, breaking dependency is like, I would say like development is here philosophically, like in my mind, to try to balance inequalities of opportunities, inequalities of chances. So, for example, us in France, we have like this public service that is still like working to some extent. And for example, you still have people that come from like low-income families that can have jobs in industries that are not like in the low wages, you know. And so I've seen RLOs, for example, giving, if you want, for example, to send someone to university, it means you have to pay for the university fees. It means you have to pay for the apartment. You have to pay for the food. You have to pay for all the studying materials. Like all of this. And what if the person wants to do a PhD or something like that, you know? And all of this is like super costly. Even myself, we had to take a loan to pay for my studies, you know? So, and I've seen like RLOs giving like big cash assistance to the communities they support so they can do whatever they want to do. But, you know, I think there is also, you have to use what you have. Like, I mean, my goal is to get the most money possible so I can redistribute it into like high impact projects. So I don't see like high impact projects as like antagonists to using the money that is available now in order to implement, you know, transformative things on the ground.
Yeah, but then just to sort of challenge from the wider perspective in using Ramwanja as an example as well. Interestingly, I've been there three times this year and spent quite a bit of time there. And rather than just visiting RLOs, I was just visiting people's houses with our colleague there, Jenny, and the people that she's got to know, or that she knows well, and just listening to their life experiences. And the interesting thing is, firstly, how little they were ever impacted positively by NGO work, like, and actually how rarely they even came in touch with them in their day-to-day work, especially as adults, maybe. They all had their own jobs of one kind or another, and they weren't really coming across all these NGOs who had massive signs and posters everywhere. But then the brief interactions they did have with them were often negative and detracting and actually distracting from what they were trying to do in their jobs. For example, in one case, someone I met was offered a job doing data collection for an NGO, but he had to pay a bribe of $500 to get the job, and then he didn't get it anyway, so he lost that money. So that was just like a purely negative experience and that was an international NGO. Now, I'm sure the headquarters didn't know that this is going on, but they also told me that there's almost no NGO in Ramwanja that doesn't have examples of corruption. So you have this aid system that's actually just extracting from the community there. And so the same people you're going to who you think should just fund RLOs as quickly as possible, they're currently funding a system that's extracting from the other hand. So, you know, maybe it should be more about deconstructing that system as a whole, as opposed to accepting that money because it's going to do something big quickly, when actually it's also doing a lot of bad quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, I see what you mean, and I think that, like, of course, like, corruption exists in the world, and money can be wasted if you're a government, if you're an international organization, a local organization. And I align with you on all the problematics that we've seen in like all the places where like global north investment has led to really problematic outcomes, like in the social good place. And I think this is here, like, for example, they'll say that ecosystem catalysts, are great allies for RLOs. It's like, how can I frame that? So I think, like, I agree with you. And I think that, like, there is corruption everywhere in the world. You know, there is corruption in the global north, at the government level, at the local organizations level. And like, we've seen many problematic examples of like problematic results of global north investments for social good. But I think that with like the RLO ecosystem and us as supporters, like, we have an opportunity to make accountability mechanisms look differently from the way it has looked historically. So for example, what we do with RLI, or like what we do us at Aropa, is to, for example, bear the brunt of the monitoring and evaluation. In the time where we do, like, we pass the money to RLOs, we bear the brunt of the meal, and we do our best, like, not to pass this burden on the grantees. And so I think that there are some requirements that are okay. You know, for example, we worked on their meal system, and we have some indicators that like are measuring the transformativeness and relevance of the services for the communities. And you know, like, we do not focus on quantitative data only, but really, for example, on dignified solutions, self-reliance, you know, so.
Yeah, no. I can agree with that, and I think it would be interesting to think about, you know, because everything I've been talking about is basically around that cynical funding particularly from government donors, but. And some of it might be unfair, and some of the corruption might be taken out, might be slightly disbalanced. It might focus on corruption and not focus on some of the positive things that can happen for sure with aid funding. But I'd be interested to think a bit about those other sources of funding, particularly from private donors, and whether you think there are ways that we could accelerate a more open-minded approach. Because I still feel that whereas private donors aren't driven by, you know, trying to satisfy their taxpayers' interests, as like in the way that public donors do, there are still quite a few other motives which we still accept as acceptable, like trying to look for sound bite impact metrics, whereby a donor can be able to claim that they, I don't know, eradicated malaria in one country, or, you know, it's definitely tempting for a donor to want to go for something quite simplistic in the way it sounds, and then claim that no one can argue with that. But then the question could be, what happens if, by aiming for this amazing impact statement that apparently no one can argue with, along the way you limit the power and agency of any community to decide what future they want to see differently, and what are the knock-on consequences, as well as the side effects of the way you implement something in such a rigid and restrictive way. You know, like if your goal was to eradicate malaria, but along the way you have to impose so many restrictions that you actually create other divisions. You create divisions in a community, you create inequalities, because ultimately it tends to be young men, leaders who are better able to speak the language that donors have or are expecting, and end up winning the race for that funding. And what does that do to a community if you're accentuating those inequalities? So you're fixing malaria while causing more sort of social disharmony. So I wonder if, you know, as when you talk about ecosystem actors and allies, what can we do more to change mindset? Because I think sometimes based on assumptions, even assumptions like malaria one's not such a good example, but if you say, you know, making families wealthier, that is an assumption that is fundamentally good for everyone, without it even being challenged. You know, so donors get this free pass to be able to come out with their theory of change, which of course it's always sort of peer reviewed, but it's really driven from really where the money's coming from as to what they want to be able to take credit for achieving. How can we reduce that mindset of wanting to control the agenda and then filter their power all the way down through where the money flows?
I mean, for me, I would say, like, there's all this like education to do with donors that we started, and include, you know, like in your relationship, for example, intermediaries that are like refugee-led intermediaries, or intermediaries like over here, for example, you know, document the problematics that you've seen in the funding that you received and pass on to the RLOs, like, of course, informed by the RLOs you supported, put it in your papers, in your reports to the donors, and push back against this kind of funding orientation, thematic funding, etc. I'll say also, like, there's a lot like we need to do in terms of literature, because I feel like the movement is a bit focusing on a few years around the arguments of saying RLOs are best placed because they know their community the best, etc. But we need to have like impact data that demonstrate the comparative advantage of RLOs and that justifies that we would invest unrestricted funding and flexible funding and high amount funding to RLOs. And I believe, you know, that like for this meal is something that could do good in the world, you know.
Isn't
And
that
also me, I have
a bit of a contradiction? Sorry, just to say we need more impact data to prove that RLOs can do more with flexible funding. Isn't that going to be impossible to demonstrate? Because by giving flexible funding, that will end up being channeled into maybe 1,000 or more different types of outcomes, then it'll be impossible to compare it to programs where the funding is restricted. And by the way, I think it's a good thing, because I don't agree. I don't think donors should need to be persuaded that funding RLOs is impactful, because again, you're then singing to their song sheet that they want to be able to achieve some kind of impact, whereas the impact is in itself by allowing a community to decide what's better for them. The donor shouldn't be able to take credit for it or be able to claim that they've achieved the impact. It's the community that achieved the impact. So what donors need to be shown is that actually got to let go of controlling the impact and laying claim or taking credit for that impact.
Yeah, I mean, the impact can be in regards to the community. You know, I mean, the accountability can be, I think like that, for example, demonstrating impact through impact measurement in regard, like impact can be whatever the community says impact will be. But I think still you need to have this impact measurement, because like, as we said, like corruption happens everywhere. And like, if you think that like corruption doesn't exist locally, I think you're wrong, you know? And I think that like you can use impact measurement as a tool for creating accountability locally. And at the same time, I'm wondering, like, I have a question for you, like if you or if an ally organization like stands in the way of money getting somewhere where like there are like M&E requirements, are you not like actually hindering the progress that you'd like to see also?
What do you mean by get in the way? I mean, if there's a donor who wants to give funds to an RLO where there's M&E requirements, then they're free to do so. Just most likely wouldn't do through Cohere. But actually, I think there should be far more of a, you know, either donors should be able to go directly to RLOs, and that's why there are some RLOs who are growing at the moment, because they're able to run those projects. And if they want to be intermediaries and subgrant with other restrictions, then you know they can do that too. If all parties involved feel that funding align, you know, restrictions align with their own vision. Yeah. So as I said, I'm not trying to pretend that the restrictive flows of funding won't continue to exist. I think there are other parallel approaches that can be more appropriate, that enable the most marginalized to actually have a say over their own futures. And by the way, I think it's the safest way to avoid corruption is actually through real trust-based relationships that connects to the most marginalized. And so I think although corruption can happen anywhere, it's more likely to happen when power is concentrated in the hands of a gatekeeper, like, for example, an INGO that's running all of the hospitals in one settlement. There's actually a lot of power centralized in the hands of very few people, and that gives them a huge temptation to engage in corruption. Unfortunately, we will have to end this first podcast, but I can see lots of routes for continuing the conversation, such as that topic about accountability and impact. That could be one we still need to unpack further, as well as thinking about crowdfunding and individual donors and how we can widen the net and not just think about a narrow vision of, you know, or perspective of who the donors are. But thank you so much, Julia, for this conversation. unlike a lot of the podcasts we've had, it'll be me just asking questions, but this one has been great because you've asked me some, but also we've had a debate as usual, which is always fun. And please come again soon so that we can finish this conversation.
Thank you, Edmund. Thank you so much for inviting me.